Alright guys, Murph's here, and today we're going to talk about this. A BCM Recce 18 chambered in 5.56. This is our latest addition in the Friendly Fire series, the series where I review guns out of my friends' collections so that we can remove my purchase bias and then discuss whether or not I would purchase them and how I would configure them if I did. Now, why don't we go ahead and get into this rifle? And for this, I'm not necessarily going to call it history as much as background. Now, there are some aspects of this rifle's designation that do invoke a little bit of history, but it is history that I've previously covered actually rather extensively in a series I did on this subject a couple of years ago, and that being the Recce rifle. So if you're interested in more thoughts on that, especially as we go through the process of this video, you should totally check out the links in the description to those previous videos. Now, I do first off want to start talking about BCM, however. Bravo Company Manufacturing is a kind of upper mid-tier producer of AR-15s, AR-15 parts, and then also, most importantly in my opinion, AR-15 uppers. Now, as we can see here, they do produce their own rifles, and that catalog online is a little difficult to navigate on your phone. It's better set up for like actual computer navigation. But they are a manufacturer of AR-15 parts, kind of akin to Aero Precision or Magpul. Now, what I find very interesting about BCM is that you could buy one of their uppers, which are great, fantastically featured quality upper receivers, and pair them with a rather inexpensive lower to get a very high quality rifle. Now, some people disagree with that methodology, stating that there are just certain minimums that you have to have on a lower receiver. I set that bar rather low. As long as a lower receiver is made of mil-spec materials and passes basic quality inspection, making sure that, you know, the pinholes and all that kind of stuff are the appropriate diameter and everything lines up appropriately, I don't really care what else is going on with that lower. It doesn't have to be ambidextrous for me. It doesn't have to have a built-in folding stock or something along those lines. The great thing about a lower is that all it has to do is house the components that you want to go into it. You can put whatever components you want to. A lot of the parts that go into a lower receiver are pretty expensive, especially if you want to have something that's relatively plain Jane. However, an upper receiver can start to really run you a lot of money, especially whenever you start talking about barrels and you know, where your optics mounting platform and all that kind of stuff is concerned. And for that, BCM does a fantastic job of putting together incredibly well-featured and nuanced rifle uppers in order to be able to get you what it is that you want out of your product at the end of the day. And this is where, if we're talking about a lot of the stuff that goes into how it is that I work and handle the rifle, there's a lot of stuff that comes into contact with the upper for that. It's not to say that the lower isn't important as much as it's to say it's much easier to put together a good lower than it is to put together a quality upper. Now, let's go ahead and get into the Recce portion of this discussion. Now, Recce rifles are an interesting discussion on the internet. A couple years ago, these became incredibly popular, and the subject still pops up every once in a while, and you can find a whole ton of Recce configured rifles out there with a wide variety of features and all that kind of stuff. I think the most important thing to get out of Recce is kind of where did it originate from, and that is with the Navy SEALs. Now, this was an initiative in the 90s and early 2000s to put together a precision AR rifle for a sniper that would be applicable in close range type scenarios as well as be a precision rifle out to distance. Now, those requirements are coming in at two different ends of the spectrum. I want something that I can fight up close, but is also really good for taking long-range shots. Now, that is less of a question of whether or not the shooter can make those shots. That's implied, that the shooter is capable of being able to make long-range impacts. And there are plenty of people who can shoot at stuff at long range, but having a rifle that lends itself well to doing it is a completely different conversation. I myself, I can do great work with red dots. I continually run red dots out beyond 400 yards and make impacts. However, that is on already identified targets. Identifying a target at 440 or beyond in order to be able to make a hit with your red dot is a completely different requirement. That's what you're looking more for in a precision type rifle. You need to be able to identify somebody who's hiding, who's potentially camouflaged, who definitely doesn't want to get shot, and then shoot them at great distance. That's kind of a tall order to then also be able to take that same rifle and be able to do CQB or any type of close range fighting. Now you can see where, especially when we're talking about the 90s, vast majority of snipers would have been running bolt action rifles at the time. I don't want to CQB with a bolt action rifle if I don't have to. I don't want to do any type of close range fighting with a sniper rifle if I don't have to. This isn't 360 no scope on Call of Duty. Now, what the SEALs would initially put together would be an M16A1 lower with a flat top upper and a 16-inch medium profile stainless steel barrel. This is a very interesting combination of features going on right there, and we'll talk about this more as we go. Now, that is the original, I don't want to say technical data package because it was never formalized into a technical data package, but that was the original feature set of a Recce rifle. And what becomes very interesting when we talk about this particular subject in this video is that we have a lot of things that are at odds here to discuss as we go through it. We have the original feature set from the Navy SEALs to discuss. We have what a lot of different influencers and stuff like that are doing on Instagram and YouTube and all these other types of social medias and all that kind of stuff with their Recce rifles. So the kind of the colloquialism aspect of it, where people have identified different features and stuff like that that they want for their specific purpose out of their Recce rifles. Then you have a lot of the other kind of parallel stuff that was going on at the same time as the Recce rifle, the SAMR from the Marine Corps, the Mark 12 that was the early iterations of which were being developed by the Green Berets. You have DMR concepts that kind of fit into this as well. You have BCM's designation for this rifle and then also the feature set that they put with it. You have the owner's actual intent for this rifle, and then you have my own opinions and preconceived notions based on my experience working around these types of rifles and different dynamic situations and all that kind of stuff. So we really actually have a potentially extremely nuanced discussion stemming around this rifle. So I hope you guys find this interesting. I hope I don't drag on too long through any things, but rabbit holes do abound. So make sure if I'm taking too long through a particular section, that you check the description and hop to the content that you want to consume. Maybe come back and get the rest later. All right, so with that, why don't we go ahead and get into the features of this particular rifle. Starting off at the front here, we have the BCM Gunfighter muzzle brake, which upon initial inspection might look like an M16A2 flash hider. However, you will note that the bottom is not fully closed off like it is on the A2, and we do have an additional chamber on the inside. Now, long-term viewers of the channel will know that I detest muzzle brakes. However, there are a couple exceptions to that rule, and this is one of them. My biggest issue with muzzle brakes is that they cause an awful lot of concussion, which can become disruptive to those around me, which sends a lot of energy bouncing back onto me in different shooting dynamics, and I'll wind up like feeling it in my nose cavity or something like that. I don't really enjoy it. However, this is not that bad. I don't notice a lot of disruption. I don't notice a lot of pressure and stuff like that coming off of it, and it still does the job of managing recoil. Now, that's not to say that the 5.56 is a heavy recoiling cartridge, as much as it is to say that the more ability you have to be able to keep the rifle on target, the better you can go ahead and drill those targets, be them at close range or at distance. You'll get faster follow-ups if you're able to keep the rifle on target, and muzzle brakes do help with that. So, I do really like this muzzle brake. Now, our barrel is an 18-inch 410 stainless steel medium profile 1-in-8 twist 5.56 chambered barrel. Now let's go ahead and kind of break this down into some portions here. 18 inches. We go off of the original feature set. 18 inches is entirely too long for a Recce rifle. If we look at the vast majority of guys building Recce rifles out on the market, 18 inches is longer than what they would do. 18 inches winds up putting me more in the mindset of a Mark 12 at that point, which would be the special purpose rifle, later on developed by the Green Berets after the Recce rifle. Now, remember that the original intent here is to be able to stretch this out to distance as well as be able to use it in close range type scenarios. So is that possible with an 18-inch barrel? Yes. Guys used to do CQB with 20-inch M16A2s. So you can absolutely do CQB with an 18-inch barrel. But there's a couple things we got to talk about with that because there's some more nuance that's involved here. Originally, when we're talking about the concept of being able to press this rifle into close range type scenarios, we're doing that around the idea that the average fighter is going to be carrying like a 14.5-inch M4. So if I go from 14.5 inches to a 16-inch barrel, that's not that big of a jump. They're actually quite comparable at that point. Potato, potato. Now, is 14.5 inches to 18 inches that big of a jump? Well, it's definitely more significant than 14.5 to 16. I mean, we're talking about a 3.5 inch difference at that point. I think we can all agree that's a pretty significant difference. But now if we look at it in the current sense of things, where we have the Mark 18 existing, so now we're talking about at the lowest a 10.3 inch barrel jumping all the way up to 18 inches, that's a big disparity. And when you consider that the Mark 18 is the go-to CQB option, you're now telling a fella who could have the opportunity to be able to use a Mark 18 for CQB that he's going to use an 8-inch longer rifle. That's a pretty significant disparity. So to me, that talks a little bit about our preference for this particular rifle. Now, if you look at this rifle on BCM's website, it is in their precision category along with their Mark 12. Not the Recce category. It just happens to have the Recce rifle features out of the Recce rifle, just paired with a longer barrel. We'll talk about that more here in a bit. Now, does a longer barrel necessarily mean greater accuracy? No, but it does mean more velocity. And when you're talking about a 5.56 whose entire ability is derived around velocity, that's not a bad thing. If you're talking about shooting out to greater distances, velocity is not a bad thing to have, in this case, to have more energy on target. Now, there's also something to be said for barrel rigidity being more important than barrel length, and we'll talk about that more here. Actually, right now, let's go ahead and get into it with the barrel steel that's used with this. This was 410 stainless, which, if you look at BCM's literature on the matter, states that this is a more rigid barrel than what you would get out of any other stainless steel barrel, which, while true, has some more context that needs to be included with it. Now, one of the things that you run into whenever you're talking about barrels and precision rifles and all that kind of stuff is barrel whip, which is as the bullet moves down the bore, there's a slight whip effect to the steel itself. It's something that is imperceptible to the human eye, but it most definitely occurs. Now, in a lighter weight barrel, there is more barrel whip. When you have a thicker, heavier barrel, you have less barrel whip. And if you decrease the length of the barrel, you have a positive impact on barrel whip. Now, the next thing talking about with that kind of rigidity aspect of it with 410 stainless is that is actually one of the major issues with stainless steel barrels. Now, in general, stainless steel has a couple of fantastic accuracy type aspects with it. You don't necessarily have a coated bore or anything along those lines, so you get better contact with the bullet, better accuracy capability out of the rifle. It takes longer for a stainless steel barrel to heat up. However, once it heats up, it doesn't necessarily dissipate heat as quickly. And they also do not degrade as fast, though a cold hammer forged and nitrided or chrome lined barrel will have a longer barrel life than a stainless steel barrel will. So keep that in mind. The uncoated bores is where this is more of an applicable discussion. However, if you look at the differences and the pros and cons of stainless steel barrels versus, your carbon steel barrels, and also the advantages and disadvantages within the stainless steel category, you will find that apparently in extremely low temperatures, you could have an increased possibility for critical failures of the barrel. And this has a lot to do with the actual process of heat treating the steel and all this kind of stuff. It's actually kind of interesting to read about, but I'm not a metallurgist by any means, and it's not necessarily something I feel very confident in discussing, but there's something to do with like sulfide and all this kind of stuff. 410 is not recommended for use in weather conditions below 0 degrees. Okay, well, yeah, 416R is apparently rated up to like -40, but the vast majority of people in this country do not live in places where this is even an applicable concern to begin with. So there's not really an issue with this being 410 stainless unless you live in areas that experience sub-0 degree weather, and those are times in which you intend to use this rifle. That's the only times it's going to wind up being an issue. Now, medium profile, that is consistent with pretty much everything else in this precision category when we talk about Recce, SAM-Rs, and the Mark 12. Now, another thing that's kind of interesting is that this barrel is not coated. It's still very much so a kind of shiny stainless steel, which the vast majority of these rifles that would have actually been used in service would have had some sort of paint or coating put over top of the steel in order to cut that down, reduce the possibility of glare. A lot of pictures I've seen of SAM-Rs don't necessarily have any type of coated barrel, but I can only imagine that Marines would have made that change in the field. Just something I find kind of interesting as a parallel between it and other types of precision rifles. Now, 1 in 8 twist. I'm a huge fan of the 1 in 8 twist. It's a really great middle point between the 1 in 7 and the 1 in 9. Stabilizes the full gambit of projectiles out of the market and also maintains pretty decent accuracy. We'll talk about that more once we get into shooting. Now, this does have a rifle length gas system, which is something that you can get with an 18-inch barrel, but you can't necessarily do with a 16-inch barrel and have it be reliable. Now, rifle length gas, if I'm being completely honest, is my favorite gas length because it is very light recoiling. And again, 5.56 is not a heavy recoiling cartridge, but if I have less recoil to overcome, it's easier for me to be able to keep that sight on target and be able to keep engaging that target until the engagement is complete. So big fan of rifle length gas in this case. All right, now our rail is BCM's KMR rail, which is a key mod rail. Let me see here. We got our key mod slots that are not covered up by these rail covers here, which these rail covers are here in order to help manage heat. Now, key mod versus M-LOK versus Picatinny. This is a discussion that I've never really gotten involved in because all I care about is the ability to be able to attach stuff to my rifle, and I'll roll it from there. I have each one of those types of rails. One thing I will say between key mod and M-LOK is that M-LOK actually won military trials where key mod apparently just barely lost, and that between key mod and M-LOK up against Picatinny, they are much lighter, thinner rails. And what I also really like about key mod and Picatinny is that I can go ahead and scale the amount of rail space to what it is that I actually need, as opposed to having all of this rail space full all the time, all this heavy Picatinny rail space all the time. That kind of annoys me. But there are also ways around that as well with different rifles that have kind of proprietary mounting systems for Picatinny rails. All right, now you'll see here that we have a QD cup installed and a VTAC 2-point adjustable sling attached to the rifle. I'm a huge fan of 2-point adjustable slings, and I also like these kind of slimline setups just because they drape around the shoulders better. Now, also keep in mind our rail does have anti-rotation tabs located here, which I'm a huge fan of. This is a minimum requirement for me on an AR-15. Our optic is a primary arms 1:6 with the ACSS Raptor reticle. Now, the ACSS Raptor reticle, for those of you who are not informed, has a kind of half circle around a chevron over top of a bullet drop compensator ladder that has holdovers for wind. And I'll roll in a picture of the ACSS reticle. This is an illuminated reticle, which I do appreciate. Big fan of 1:6s with illuminated reticles. Now, what I can say for this reticle, this illumination, is that it's actually quite good. I have a TrueGlow Omnia 1:6 that has absolutely abysmal illuminated reticle. It does not stand out in any amount of sunlight. I actually really dislike it. This did fairly well in the lighting conditions, though admittedly it's not necessarily the middle of summer right now when I'm evaluating this optic, but for my purposes right now I've had no issue being able to pick up the red dot, or excuse me, the illumination on the reticle. Now, this is a first focal plane reticle, which first focal plane and second focal plane is not necessarily something that I split hairs over. The important thing to know about each of them is at what magnification your values are true, so that you can be able to calculate shots and make adjustments and all that kind of stuff on the fly. Now, one of the things I like about the ACSS reticle is that it is fairly bare bones while still having a lot of information available without being too distracting to the eye. So I have windage holdovers coming down in kind of like a Christmas tree setup, but it's not so much data. It's not like every 5 yards. So it's not so much data that it's difficult for me to quickly pick it up and be able to apply it in a rapid fire scenario, while also still being able to dial it up, get really zoomed and sucked into that reticle, and be able to make better adjustments for shots on the fly. Now, a 1:6, how do I feel about this on a Recce style rifle? I think a 1:6 is probably about the minimum choice on a Recce style rifle, and you could definitely go more powerful if you wanted to. SEALs originally were running a 2.5 to 10 power scope on theirs, so that kind of gives you an idea of what you ought to be looking at. Now, we also have this set into an Aero Precision AR-15 mount, which is a relatively lightweight mount, but we'll talk about that more here in a bit. All right, guys, now let's go ahead and talk about this charging handle real quick. This is a BCM Gunfighter charging handle, which we can see has, turn it this side, an extended latch. I do prefer extended latch charging handles whenever it comes to magnified optics, because it's easier to be able to grip around the magnified optic and get a hold of the extended latch charging handle. My biggest issue with extended latch charging handles is that they have a tendency to kind of get hooked on gear and all that kind of stuff. So if you're walking around in body armor and you have an extended latch charging handle, it might get hung up on something, and it's kind of annoying. So most of the time I run standard mil-spec AR-15 charging handles, but I do have a couple of extended boys in the collection. Now, our bolt is a 158 Carpenter steel bolt, and it is M16 profile and all that kind of stuff. High quality bolt. We do have M4 feed ramps and all that kind of stuff. Kind of the typical thing that I expect to see on an AR-15 these days. All right, guys. Now, if you've seen any of my videos about AR-15s, you know what I have to say about the receiver section. So, if you don't necessarily want to hear that all over again, go ahead and skip ahead in the chapters. For the rest of you who have not, this rifle is outfitted with a dust cover. I'm a big fan of the dust cover. This is a minimal requirement to me. I close this every opportunity I get because this is my opportunity to make sure that the system is sealed up. I'm guarding against the ingress of foreign material, and I'm keeping it clean so that if it needs to come up and on target, it's ready to go. Some people omit these for like weight savings or cost savings or something along that line, and I would say that any of those cost savings or weight savings are not as important as keeping the system clean. Now we have a brass deflector here on the side of the rifle. Again, some people omit these in order to kind of have a more streamlined receiver, which I will agree looks very nice. However, I do a lot of like cross-shoulder shooting and stuff like that. I have a left-handed shooter in the family. I would much sooner have a brass deflector to help me not eat brass when I'm shooting off my support side as opposed to not. Now, the forward assist. The forward assist is a hot button topic out on the market. A lot of people will sit there and say, well, Eugene Stoner didn't want the gun to have a forward assist. When have you ever used a forward assist? The forward assist is going to wind up causing more trouble than it's going to actually solve. Well, guys, I can tell you that I actually quite frequently use a forward assist. A lot of times whenever I step up on the line, I conduct a little press check, make sure everything's good to go, and then I tap the forward assist to make sure that the bolt goes into battery so that when I come up for that string of fire, I have a click bang instead of a click no boom, because that click in real life would be deafening. So if you're getting ready to roll out a patrol or something like that, do your quick press check, or about to go run a mission, shoot a training course, whatever it is, that forward assist is your opportunity to make sure that everything is good to go when this rifle comes up. And I've been to a lot of places, a lot of competitions, a lot of courses, and I've seen people come up and have their gun not go off when they want it to. And I'm just saying, in real life, that could be a real bad game changer for you. So, big fan of the forward assist for that reason. All right, now we have a standard safety selector on the side here. It is not ambidextrous. That's not a con to me. My original training on the AR-15 was around single side safeties, so it's still very natural to me to kind of curl my hand back to place it back on safe, and then utilize the kind of inside of my hand to place the weapon on fire. We have a standard magazine release. We have a standard bolt release. Not a whole lot to talk about there. Standard mag well. We do have a winter guard trigger, so you have a little bit more space for a gloved hand. And let's go ahead, trigger guard, excuse me, winter trigger guard. Let's go ahead and talk about this trigger. Now, this is a kind of polished trigger from BCM. And I've got to be completely honest, guys, I'm not the biggest fan. Now, in general, I'm not a trigger snob. I'm just fine with mil-spec triggers and all that kind of stuff. I don't feel that I derive my capability only from the trigger. Like, accuracy is a more comprehensive combination of factors than just trigger. But some people get really bent out of shape over triggers, so I go ahead and discuss them here on the channel. Now, starting off, we have a very minimal amount of take-up, but a very imperceptible wall, which is what really annoys me. And this is kind of my issue with these more polished style mil-spec triggers, is that I lose some of the tactile aspects. So even like that reset, I'm used to a much louder, stronger reset. And this just kind of like, blah, into place. And then that tiny amount of take up, no real perceptible wall, and then I break through and break that shot. So I'm not a huge fan of this trigger, but we'll talk about that more in shooting because you wouldn't really be able to tell. Now, this is a BCM gunfighter grip, which does have a pocket here for like batteries or Tootsie Rolls or whatever it is that you want to put in there. I do really like these grips. They're a nice vertical shape. I actually have a new project that I'm working on right now that finally has, I finally put a BCM grip on. Normally, guys, I don't get bent out of shape over grips. Most of my grips are A2 pistol grips that I've dremeled off the A2 bump. But I have to say that this is very comfortable, and I do appreciate that. All right, we have a standard mil-spec buffer tube, and we come back to here, and this is BCM's version of a SOP mod stock, which I'm not the biggest fan of the SOP mod because I always found it to be a little too fat. It kind of pushes my face off of the rifle, whereas this stock is very slim. It doesn't necessarily have that same effect. It's actually kind of comfortable for my face shape, so I do appreciate that. We do have M-LOK cups, or excuse me, QD cups set into the stock, as well as a QD cup into our back plate here. All right, guys, that's features. How does it shoot? All right, so right off the bat, guys, first off, recoil is very light. It's very easy to keep this rifle on target and all that kind of stuff. When it comes to accuracy, both of the targets that I have to show you here today were shot cold bore. And this is a very important distinction. So on the first day that I went out, I shot at 100 yards some 55 grain Tula FMJ. And our cold bore target, or cold bore impacts, came out as such. So we have a 3.5 inch group. There's our first round right there. And the other 4 clustered in at just over an inch. 3.5 inch overall, but that 4-shot cluster coming in just over an inch, that's very interesting, especially for steel case Tula ammunition. Now, I took it out the next weekend, and I shot some PMC 55 grain FMJ boat tail, which I've had some pretty good results with accuracy out of this load before. And here we can see yet again I have a low cold bore first impact, and then the other 4 clustering fairly tight. Now this is a 1 3/8 inch group overall. These 4 come in at just under an inch, at roughly 0.9. So I think it's safe to say that this rifle is 1 MOA with just slightly better ammunition. This is bulk pack FMJ 55 grain stuff. None of this is super nice. If you just spent a little bit more time on your ammunition, you could definitely get sub MOA groups, possibly half MOA with actual match grade ammunition. So clearly this trigger is not holding this gun back. This barrel is doing everything that it's supposed to be doing. This compensator makes it really great to keep this rifle on target for all that kind of stuff. I shot this thing offhand at 50 yards, had no problem keeping everything within the A zone. 。 I shot this thing off of a barrier, and this was my chance to really kind of stress this optic a little bit, because one of the things you have to keep in mind with magnified optics as you work around cover and all that kind of stuff is how forgiving is your eye box. That's kind of the true judge of any 1-6. Especially if you're taking more distant shots, how well can I dial up in order to be able to properly observe that target and get the best hit that I can, but also be able to work around a confined space and actually be able to get the optimum, standoff and eye box and all that type of thing. Now, for the most part, I didn't have too much issue with this rifle until it came into getting into the really unorthodox positions, like shooting with the rifle more or less kind of set on my shoulder. That is where I started having issues with eye box, and I had to dial back the optic a little bit. Now, of course, we have this fast throw lever here, which makes it really quick and easy to be able to dial between your optical ranges here on this magnified optic. However, and it's not even a however. So every now and again you'll see somebody say, well, this way I can go ahead. I know this stage I shouldn't need more than 4 power, so I'll just go ahead and dial it to 4 power. Vast majority of people need these fast throw levers because you're going from 1 to 6. Those are your options. It's a very binary thing, yes, no. Because if you're talking about shooting in dynamic situations, you don't have time to go, I think 5 power would be better for this. That's more of like I'm doing some sort of glassing observation type thing, and I'm using my rifle to do that instead of like dedicated binos or other types of observational platforms. If you're shooting this and you're actively engaging an opponent, you're going to go, that guy's kind of far away. I'm going to dial up to 6. Or that dude's fairly close or fairly exposed. I feel like I can definitely engage him at 1 power and then go storm this house or whatever it is that you've got going on. Like you're not, 6 is too much. I'm going to use 2 power for this engagement as somebody keeps chipping away at your cover. Like, that's silly. I've seen these types of conversations on the internet and it just makes me roll my eyes. All right, now when it came to shooting off of that barricade and shooting, all kinds of different positions and stuff, or a couple of different positions and stuff like that, most of my impacts were within the A zone at 100 yards. So I'm okay with that, and I'm definitely pretty happy with this optic overall. All right, guys, that's shooting. What are my recommendations when it comes to this rifle? So that's a kind of difficult question to answer, and a lot of it has to come down to this rifle's length. Would I recommend this starting off with as a home defense rifle? In its present configuration, which is how I'm evaluating all of these guns that I'm doing in the Friendly Fire series, I would not recommend this for home defense, and that's purely because of a lack of a light. Had a light on this, I would recommend it for home defense. It's not necessarily a CQB monster, but you can still do it. And if you're living in a situation where you can barricade yourself and only be responsible for perhaps you or your spouse, then you can totally handle this in a home defense situation. Okay, well, what about more like a duty sense? Okay, well, it kind of depends on the duty. If you're talking about taking longer range precision shots, I could see this. But this, in present configuration, is lacking a lot of stuff that I would want to see on a duty rifle. So, like I say, in present configuration, I would want to see more stuff for duty type use. And I would also need to see scenarios that require it for duty type use. If like you're law enforcement and stuff like that, are you taking longer range shots? Is that something that's actually going to be a situation that you're going to encounter, or are you going to be better suited with a 16-inch or shorter rifle that is going to be more applicable to the scenarios that you're actually going to be involved in? Well, what about as a hunting rifle? Well, 18 inches and this rifle setup, this would actually be a fairly interesting varmint rifle. And that also kind of becomes an interesting option as like a truck gun for somebody who has a lot of land. A farm gun or something along those lines. You can throw this in the back of the truck and take pot shots at, stumps or varmints or something along those lines. Be able to take it out hunting as well. Like, you could actually get a lot of versatility out of this rifle and its length in a more open space on a farm. And that's actually kind of, the more open space is kind of a major part of this overall subject moving forward. Now, as a competition rifle, would I recommend this? Absolutely. Especially if you're shooting competitions that actually do reach out to range as well as have some close range type setups. I think this is a very well set up rifle for that type of shooting. I think this would do exceedingly well. And you do run into 18-inch length competition guns. There are some that are built from the factory. Let's see, Ruger and Daniel Defense offer 18-inch competition guns. So I think this would actually come in quite handy for that. All right, guys. That's recommendations. Would I buy it? Yes, absolutely. This thing is fantastic for its accuracy and all that kind of stuff. I would absolutely buy this rifle. So with that being the case, then, how would I configure it? So this becomes a little bit more of the nuanced portion of this discussion here. A lot of this comes down to its intent. Now, with this being an 18-inch barrel, I do think that I would put this into the role of kind of like a Mark 12, which, if you guys have been on the channel for a little while, or you've already checked out the links in the description, you know that I have built a Mark 12 inspired rifle previously. This is my Mark 12 Mod Murph, which has an 18-inch barrel and a 2-to-7 power optic and all that kind of stuff. Now, Murph, you've already got a Mark 12. Why do you need another one? Well, that's because I would configure this Mark 12 a little bit differently than the Mod Murph. So for this, I would keep this 1-to-6 power optic because I do like this, and I do think this does a good job of fitting into the close range role better than my 2-to-7 does. Not that my 2-to-7 doesn't. It's just that we're working with what we have right here. Now, this does not presently have backup irons on it, and this is not a quick detach mount. So I would not put irons on this because I have no way of removing the scope rapidly in order to be able to get to them. So I'd probably wind up doing some type of offset optic, like a Holosun 403 or something like that. Offset mount, so that if I'm dialed up to 6 and something pops up closer, instead of having to break, take my hand off the rifle, dial, and then engage that target, I can just rotate and engage it. Which I've done a lot of work with that with the Mark 12 Mod Murph, and it's great. It's absolutely fantastic to transition between those. Also supports side shooting, much easier to do with a rollover optic than not. Now, would I add a bipod like I have on the Mark 12 Mod Murph? No, I would not. I would keep this rifle more lightweight, but I would add a flashlight, because in this case, I would be preferencing this rifle for very close range fights with the ability to be able to engage out at distance. This, to me, with an 18-inch barrel, is preferencing more open areas. But with the kind of lightweight of the rifle, I would like this to still be able to be pushed into that close range role and be good at it. And that's one of the key things here. This rifle, bare bones, is 7 pounds, and its current configuration comes in at 8.2. That's pretty light. Now, of course, adding a rollover optic and a light is going to add some weight to it, but it's still going to be a fairly lightweight and precise rifle. It's going to be punching well above that weight in accuracy. Because a lot of times you'll see sniper rifles and stuff like that are quite heavy. It helps settle the rifle down some more, but it makes it absolutely abhorrent to carry. This is going to be fairly trim and svelte for its size, making it not just easy to carry and easy to be able to work around CQB type situations, but it's also going to make it point and flow very naturally for any type of close range engagements that you're going to get involved in. That is something that cannot be highly touted enough in this case. So I would most definitely set it up in that manner. Now, what is this to the owner? Well, this is a kind of Mark 12 esque design for the owner. That is his intent for this rifle. It's also kind of his go-to do-all rifle. Now, the only issue with that right now that I see is that we don't have any type of backup optic and we don't have a light on this rifle. And his justification for that is that he has more CQB short type setups that he's running lights on, and that if he really wanted to run this rifle, he would take lights off of those and put it onto this rifle. My only issue with that overall is that your rifles are not all ready to go at the same time. You have to do some type of moving around of accessories in order to be able to make everything ready to go. And in my opinion, everything should be plug and play ready. But that's also really expensive, and I understand why everybody's not necessarily on that same train, because I've spent a lot of money in order to be able to have that capability for my guns, and I don't necessarily believe that everybody has that same affection for that thought process. I get it, I understand. There's other dynamics, there's other things that have to be paid for, but you know, that's my opinion, that's my pure preference, not necessarily your problem. All right, guys, I think that pretty much covers my thoughts on this particular subject. I hope you guys found this interesting, and that's pretty much what I got. Have a good day.